I think as a teenager, like many teenagers growing up in the 80s, I was very interested in computers. There was this real computer boom, the ZX81s and Dragon 32s and Ataris, etc. And I got caught up in it in my teens, and I think I was always interested in computers. And I guess the movie Blade Runner was a huge influence, actually, funnily enough. The character Dr. Eldon Tyrell, these kind of machines, these AIs. I loved the movie. And I think I hired Blade Runner from the video shop one day, and as a teenager wondering what he's going to do for the rest of his life, it kind of just clicked. Dr. Eldon Tyrell, I'm going to be Dr. Eldon Tyrell. So that's how, I guess that's when lots of kind of thoughts, sci-fi influences all through my childhood. 2000 AD, it was kind of sci-fi movies, C-3PO, and the computers all kind of became crystallized through the movie Blade Runner, funnily enough, yeah. And then that's how I guess it really began, the quest. Well, I guess one of the Eureka moments, there's been many, a whole succession of Eureka moments. I mean, I kind of started off reading off about neural networks in the 80s and conventional artificial intelligence and just absorbing what was out there. Learning in my late teens, before starting a university course in artificial intelligence, before I started the course, I realized what's happening in academia was actually not quite artificial intelligence. It really wasn't going anywhere, I decided, funnily. And then that was like a sort of eureka moment, that basically the mainstream, the conventional paths didn't lead anywhere. And so then I broke out on my own path. And I guess one of the eureka moments was this idea that the brain is fractal. So I encountered fractals back in school in the 80s, learning about the Mandelbrot set and about diffusion limited aggregates, reading magazines like Scientific American. And I think it's been an idea that's stuck in my mind. And in the course of, say, my 20s, I mean, I started seeing fractals in the brain, and I guess in 96, 97, I think the real eureka moment was when I really started to crystallize. I really started to interpret all the stuff I learned about the brain, the incomplete information I had back then in terms of fractals, and it seemed to really fit together. And then since then, in the late 90s, all the new information I accumulated really fitted into this scheme perfectly. So that's one eureka moment among many. I think it's to do with lots of clever people in mainstream science, lots of creative people, but I think it's to do with organizational structures that mainstream science is compartmentalized into different departments. I think also you have kind of social factors like kind of dominance hierarchies, that you're basically entering into a dominance hierarchy, which has nothing to do with creativity or coming up with good ideas. It's really fitting into a system. So I think this kind of dissolvedness of how academic departments kind of splinter something which should be multidisciplinary, seen as a whole. They're looking at the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle in parts, and something as complex as the brain and artificial intelligence needs to be understood as one kind of composite whole. So when academia does multidisciplinary integration, it's like summer camps, summer schools and stuff. I mean, when I think about integration, it really is seeing things as one. So I think that's one reason, this kind of like specialization in academia. And the second thing is that this power game I kind of mentioning, I saw it in university. I went to a big research university in London, did my undergraduate degree there, and I realized basically that if I went the PhD path, then really you're basically furthering the ideas of existing institutions and existing professors, which might not be correct. And you're basically, looking after undergraduates, and you're basically towing the line, developing existing ideas which might be defunct, and really have to work hard to get your PhD and to fit into the system and earn promotion. By the time you have the freedom to do your own thing, and you've actually climbed the kind of monkey power hierarchy to get the freedom to do your own thing, you're too old. You become a professor. You've got the time now and the power and the freedom to pursue your own ideas, but I think it's too late. So I really went the other way. So I went to the kind of, I guess, the social wilderness, where I didn't have much resources outside of academia, and I didn't have access to books or hardware and computers, but I had complete and total freedom to think my own thoughts, and I think that's the reason why. Well, a simple example is so much research in academia is directed towards weapons and weapons manufacture and defense and stuff, which is good for armies of industrialized countries, but isn't necessarily good for like science. So that's one example. But also, say, superstring theory. I mean, I read a book, What's Wrong with Science, written by a distinguished physicist, and he basically says that they've gone down a complete blind alley in pursuing just one line of thought. And he's saying that there's other approaches that really, this is all mainstream science, and basically, say, the other competitor, loop quantum gravity, hasn't really been given funding. So it's all gone to superstring theory, which might be now turning out to be a complete blind alley. Well, I guess specifically what I was saying last night, what I was talking about was this mesolimbic dopamine system. And neuroscientists separate out the process of reinforcement and addiction into two processes. They call what's called the aspect which leads to gaining the reward, then the actual kind of consuming of the reward. So you actually have the kind of chains of behaviors which lead to the actual getting the reward, then the actual reward itself. I mean, dopamine specifically, the mesolimbic dopamine system is implicated in the kind of like the chaining of behaviors to get that reward. And then you have the actual pleasure, which would be the emotion centers. But I'd say that the chaining begins from that, that rush, that emotion center, that orgasm, or that kind of, which is programmed by these emotion centers, hypothalamus, amygdala, etc. Now, what I didn't say last night, just to cut out complexity, is that reward is a two-pronged process, because it's a carrot and stick. So what I talked about last night was the carrot, the reward, and the kind of the motivation and the kind of chaining of behaviors to get that reward. But also the stick element, obviously, is very important, and that's also another function of the amygdala, especially the fear process. That it's not just reward; it's also escaping the aversion of withdrawal. And sometimes people get addicted because they take substances to suppress the anxiety or suppress the negativity. And then when the drug goes, then negativity returns. So that's kind of carrot and stick of addiction. So I definitely agree with what you're saying. And so really what I tried to cover last night, just in a compressed format, was something far more complex than just mesolimbic dopamine. So it's carrot and stick, and I completely didn't really talk about the stick really. But it's a fascinating subject, and in later talks, when I really have to create artificial intelligences and really understand the system's motivation, then you have to incorporate all these separate elements. I mean, also that not just reward, and you have this fractalization of reward, amygdala, hypothalamus, ventral medial, prefrontal cortex, etc. Not only is reward fractalized, but what I didn't talk about is also that the stick, aversion, fear, inhibition is also fractal as well. Right. Okay.
So if people have got a sort of a damaged brain, how does that affect the fractal nature of it?
Okay, what we have in the brain is a lot of built-in redundancy. So often, what you showed last night, the hierarchy, there's kind of like redundant pathways. You can chop out entire bits, and it still works, not as well, but it still works. The fact that it is fractal means that means you can chop out bits, and we have what's called graceful degradation. That you maybe miss out functions, but the rest of the brain still works. But also, because it's fractal, it means that if you damage your brain, another bit can take over, because it's the same architecture. Oh no, I'd say all behavior, all intelligence really is something which can be completely understood and explained. And when we talked about more kind of mystical things and kind of more cosmic things, I'd say there is a kind of cosmic dimension, a kind of cosmic mind, infinite mind, which goes beyond the finite brain. And that's the kind of domain of the prophet, of the seer. But also, even mathematicians and scientists talk about this Platonic realm. Roger Penrose talks about this kind of transcendent realm where mathematical ideas come out of. But it's the same realm as William Blake said, that the source of prophecy and the poetic muse are one and the same. So I really believe that this kind of infinite mind, infinite consciousness, is something that is beyond the finite brain. But I would say on a day-to-day basis, the things we do on a finite level, when the doors of perception aren't cleansed, can be completely understood and mechanized. What we have now is a kind of a huge set of ideas. I mean, you have the brain theory and the kind of cosmology and metaphysics that goes with it, and a complete Weltanschauung, a complete worldview. I mean, specifically with the brain theory, it's down to me to really kind of create the working prototype. So I'll be like Linus Torvalds. I won't create all Linux, but I'll create the kernel. And from the kernel, I aim to create a startup. It might be called a startup at end of time. It might be called, Fractal Brains Corporation. I don't know, but I think the idea is to commercialize it, and also to bring the theory out, and also to disseminate the ideas, and to create artificial intelligence essentially, and to bring it to the world. So I need to create some kind of institute, some kind of company or a startup to really kind of bring out and create working prototypes and working artificial intelligence with an eye on creating this technological singularity.
What would be the purpose of creating the artificial intelligence?
Really, it's understanding the brain. It's a kind of a worthy aim and pleasure in itself. But I think the wider goal of creating artificial intelligence really is a kind of I think it's inevitable, but I think it's a really virtuous thing, and I think it's the technology of all technologies, this technological singularity. It is prophetic. I mean, it's the implications of the technological singularity. It's such a huge transition in the kind of the progress of history that really you're trying to really take humanity, take the progression of history to another level. So there's the wider aim. There's the kind of political and spiritual goals, but there's a kind of very concrete goal of creating something that can really transform the world in a fundamental way.
So do you believe in the sort of Terminator scenario where computers or AI will be more intelligent than the human brain?
I think these tech noir scenarios and all these kind of doomsday scenarios of artificial intelligence are very interesting and valid to explore, and are possibilities. And I think we need to be aware of these possibilities, these kind of tech noir nightmare scenarios of artificial intelligence. But I think that's the reason why this technology, this understanding of the brain and advent of artificial intelligence and the technological singularity needs to go hand in hand with this spiritual revelation of mystery of consciousness, mystery of God one and the same, and revival of humanistic enlightenment and spiritual values. So I think in the wrong hands, artificial intelligence and the singularity can really create this doomsday nightmare Terminator scenario. But I think it's something which is inevitable, and it needs to be steered towards something far, far better and far more just and better for the human race. I don't really see a kind of scenario of artificial intelligence or computers replacing humans. I really see a kind of or augmentation of human beings, and really a kind of a really symbiosis between humans and nature nature and technology.
So, but if the artificial intelligence is created by man, its limitations will always be what's programmed within the artificial intelligence?
Sure.
It can never come outside of those boundaries.
Or
can it?
Well, I think, yeah, this is an interesting question. What I think is that basically, last night we talked about the hypothalamus and these primitive emotion centers. We have this amazing structure called the cerebral cortex, which does all this intelligent stuff, but it's actually yoked to these primitive structures of sex, status, survival, and etc. And I believe I don't believe in the scenario of artificial intelligence as taking over the world, because I think what we create is basically also going to be extensions of this ongoing process of survival and reproduction and propagation, I believe. So even though we have this amazing cerebral cortex, which is most of the brain where all the intelligent actions going on, it subserves the hypothalamus. And it's very difficult for this prefrontal cortex to override these primitive centers. In fact, this intelligent machinery serves those primitive centers. And I see the advent of artificial intelligence and this technological singularity as basically an extension of that process. So I guess life started as kind of autocatalytic loop, chemical autocatalytic loop, which has continued with multicellular animals, continued with the advent of the hypothalamus, continued with the development of advanced cerebral cortices, and will continue with the advent of artificial intelligence and the technological singularity. I say it's one continuum.
But wouldn't you say that nature within itself is complete within its anyway, without sort of, depends what you call technology, but extending the human race as in...
Oh, sure, yeah. An interesting question, because I believe that the ultimate destiny of the universe is this kind of cosmic Christ, this universal Vishnu, this celestial Buddha, where the entire universe becomes one form, and I believe we're one stage of an ongoing process. And I believe technology and culture really is an extension of biological evolution, and I see the advent of artificial intelligence, the process by which we explore the stars and explore other galaxies and link up with other galaxies and eventually to this cosmic organism as one continuing process and one organism. So I really see a kind of like continuation between ourselves and culture and technology, really. And I don't think I don't think it ends with human bodies and life on Earth. I think it goes on.
From my point of view, like, all technology is doing is just replicating what we can do anyway.
Sure.
Like, I truly believe that we were telepathic, and some people are telepathic, and then all you do is people get a mobile phone and they start talking to them when they could communicate in some way before anyway. So all technology is doing at the moment, and it's probably because it's going down the wrong path.
Yeah.
It's just replacing what we were always capable of doing.
Well, in a sense, I mean, because I believe in the fractal brain, also the fractal universe, in a sense we are kind of anthropomorphically projecting out into the world and the universe our own image. Mm-hmm. So I think, transhumanism, this idea of the technological singularity, exploration of the stars and creating this cosmic Christ, is exactly as you say. It's basically just this replication of this fractal image, which you might call the image of God, as above, so below, as is the microcosm, so is the macrocosm. And I see it as a very organic, natural process. So yeah, I mean, in a sense, I do agree with you, mm-hmm. and I think it's very natural to do.
Mm-hmm. So, where do you want to go with the future with this theory? Where's the future?
I think really, at this stage, I'm still voice in the wilderness. Is really starting this year to break into the mainstream, really. I mean, the implications immediately for brain science are huge, and the field of artificial intelligence, they'll get it pretty quickly. And then I think next kind of foreseeable future really will be in terms of developing the theory, programming it, developing the formalism, communicating it to the wider artificial intelligence community and brain science community in the coming years, and to really commercialize it. And then, I mean, in the more long term, I mean, basically, we use this as a springboard to communicate the more kind of metaphysical, cosmological, and the bigger picture that's based on the brain theory. But in immediate terms, it's really the world of science, technology, really, and commerce. Really, the software exists as a single recursive algorithm, and as I tried to explain last night, basically the theory shows that the process by which brains come to being, this kind of neurogenesis process of cells dividing, which is also how bodies come into being, doubling of cells, and how the process that brains link up, how neurons link up laterally, and also how neurons back project recurrent collaterals, cell assemblies and patches to animate temporal sequences. It's all one process. So what the brain theory shows quite ingeniously is how from a recursive atom, like a fertilized egg, it subdivides, and in virtual brains, memory space, to create a virtual brain. So the actual software manifests as a kind of seed that grows out into the computing resources you throw at it. So it's interesting because the amount of CPU power you have, the amount of memory you have, the algorithm fits in automatically, it grows into what you give it. So the more memory, obviously, the more kind of virtual neurons you can express, and the more CPU power, the more clock cycles, or the faster you can process those neurons. Now, obviously, from a recursive atom, that is the fertilized egg, there's lots of information in the DNA that specifies exactly how bodies are joined together and exactly how brains wire. So in the same way, this recursive atom, it contains a kind of its own internal DNA, which tells it how to, at specific points, junctures, to code specific pre-wired regions in your virtual brain. And then these pre-wired regions link up just like a real brain. But I think it's ingenious. I think it's also the fact that this compact description of the brain also corresponds with how real brains form, gives the theory much more kind of correspondence with reality, I believe. So I think for years I kind of delayed programming my ideas in artificial intelligence, because in the past 25 years, always I would see better ways of condensing my understanding. So I was half-programmed neural networks in my late teens, early 20s, and then I'd see better ways of doing it. And I realized, this is basically not the way to go. And ongoing, seeing better compressions, better ways of understanding the brain, I've come to this kind of recursive atom that unfolds into all these past approaches that I considered. So it's a kind of ultimate compactification, if you like. I'm very excited about the theory because one, it is expressed in the simplest formalism that can possibly be expressed in binary trees and binary combinatorial codes, but also the compression of the entire theory into this recursive atom is absolutely the most parsimonious description it can possibly compress into. So in that way, that's why I believe it's not just any old brain theory, but it's actually something, something definitive, something, something final. Well, JPEG is, the theory does lots of existing kind of, computer technologies, compression technologies, but does it in a completely fractal way. I mean, JPEG isn't particularly fractal. I mean, JPEG does, it's more akin to wavelet transforms, really, the way brain theory works, which is kind of like, it kind of decomposes images in a fractal way. And then the fractal decompositions, the kind of codes are completely fractal. So it's multi-resolution, so it analyzes images in a multi-resolution way. Like you might take a low-resolution, breakdown of the image and code that. But that same vector or code is also used for the subcomponents in a completely fractal way. So it's like wavelet transforms, but in a kind of that's also fractal, but it does it in a more flexible manner. I guess JPEG 2000 is wavelets, but conventional JPEGs is cosine transforms. It's not that efficient. It's mainly the quantization step when you chop off all the bits that gives normal JPEG its power. What the brain theory does do is to form very compact descriptions, and I guess it does that kind of bit chopping, quantizing automatically in the way it works. I think in the future there'll be complete talks about existing algorithms, and you just go through the existing algorithms and then show how the brain theory subsumes or relates to those existing algorithms. I mean, say, because the theory is completely recursive, I mean, it's basically, because it derives from this recursive atom, it's absolutely completely recursive at all levels and all scales. I mean, it will do many of the most exciting algorithms in the world, not just compression algorithms, but also, say, the Google algorithm, which works on two levels. It works on the level of, keywords and web pages. So type in keywords, I mean, without going into details, I mean, basically, they have like long lists of all the words in a web page. Then they have like lists of all the web pages that contain a word. So these are data structures of words and web pages. But what the brain theory does is what the Google algorithm does, but does it in a completely fractal way. Pixels, letters and words and sentences and paragraphs. And also it does with words, what it does with words also does with sounds and images as well. Because it's a generic theory that describes in the brain the subsymbolic, i.e., kind of sensory motor primitives to composite representations of sensing and doing, but also the kind of cognitive, linguistic, and more abstract in one description and one language. So I think, it's something I will be talking about a lot in the future, basically the kind of algorithmic aspects of the brain theory. Well, yeah, I specifically talked about the kind of like alpha, beta, gamma, and delta and theta waves last night. I mean, yeah, I mean, everything in the universe is a resonator. Everything in the universe is a wave, and the brain is no different. And you know, there are all these theories of stimuli at certain frequencies that will affect your brain in dramatic ways. I mean, obviously, the very dramatic example is epileptic walking past a picket fence, generating a certain frequency, and that will generate an epileptic seizure. So, I mean, that's obviously a very direct example. But I mean, there's more subtle things which we don't really understand that much about, which powers that be might understand more about. And yeah, I mean, interesting ways to train the brain and to sync the brain and to enhance the brain using kind of external frequencies to phase lock and to boost kind of intrinsic frequencies, yeah. But it's exciting, yeah, definitely something that's massive area of research that people do talk a lot about. But specifically last night, what I talked about last night was more kind of limited kind of talk about brainwaves. Well, the brain theory is going to give insights how the brain works for one, but give insights as to how the brain rewires. Well, I guess because it's a fractal architecture, it kind of shows how bits of damaged brain can be compensated by other bits of damaged brain. But also the brain theory comes into a lot of practical application. Is not just damaged brains, but also learning, and also kind of shows how people can learn better. In the long term, I really see the brain theory as kind of relating to all these kind of things like NLP, things like these kind of self-development methods, and the kind of unified theory of not just the brain, but all the kind of things we do with our brains, including healing our brains and improving our brains. So I see it's a kind of in the future an extension of the theory, but we just need a kind of way of kind of like last night I showed how the brain theory bridges these two worlds of. Well, I mean, the brain theory with the fractal decomposition unifies all different parts of the brain, but the formalism I use to express the brain theory, binary trees and binary combinatorial codes, bridges all that neuroscience with artificial intelligence and computer science. I guess a further extension, an inevitable extension of the brain theory, apart from all the cosmic stuff, is really practical applications of the brain, learning, self-development, and healing brains. So I think that's a huge kind of area of research, obviously. But I really see in the future kind of unification of all these kind of new age methods, techniques, and things that we do to improve our lives and improve our brains. No, completely right. I mean, we're not. I agree. I mean, the idea that schizophrenia was a major disease. I mean, it's many diseases, a syndrome. But the idea that they called it one illness and one treatment, Largactil, which really is like, it's kind of funny what they give to treat schizophrenics in the past. I mean, it's also what they called liquid cosh in prisons, what they give the prisoners just to basically shut them down. So it really was shutting down their frontal lobes. It's really like chemical prefrontal lobotomy. The new generation neuroleptics, anti-schizophrenic medications are more selective, but still, shutting down brains. I mean, I've got some friends in the IOP in London, Institute of Psychiatry, and what they recommend is a combination of cognitive therapy and drugs, which seems more positive approach. In some cases, I mean, some mental illnesses are so extreme that you really need kind of more extreme approaches. But I think in most cases where drugs are prescribed, especially depression and the so-called hyperactivity disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, it's really fictions of drug companies really to sell drugs, and as you say, it's really not helping people. It's really just suppressing people and shutting people down. I think what the brain theory will show that there's kind of variety in human beings, and all this variety is not necessarily mental illness, and a lot of it's actually quite valid. And kind of adaptation, really. But I wouldn't agree with, say, Scientologists or some people who say all psychiatry is bad and all drug therapies are bad. I'd say most of them are pretty useless and really marketing scams for drug companies. Yeah. Yeah, I think what the medical profession is lacking is this kind of unified understanding of the brain, understanding how the brain works. They're really shooting in the dark, really. I mean, without understanding, even though it's getting better. I mean, with all these imaging studies and a lot of neuroscience is brand new. All these kind of circuits that I showed in last night's talk were only really discovered in the past 5-10 years, and that I showed a discovery just published this year. So it's all brand new. So scientists and psychiatrists do their best, and in a sense, these cures were better than no cure, like Actil and these kind of primitive neuroleptics. And this guy won a Nobel Prize literally for prefrontal lobotomies, and he collected his Nobel Prize in a wheelchair because one of his ex-patients shot him. So he discovered he didn't like his prefrontal lobotomy. He realized something had gone wrong. So and that doesn't mean Egaz Moniz, who discovered the prefrontal lobotomy, he wasn't necessarily bad, but just didn't understand what's happening with the brain. He thought the frontal lobes didn't do anything, so just chop them out. But anyway, so scientists and psychiatrists are really scrambling to really understand better brain chemistry and brain anatomy. But what the brain theory will do is basically give this kind of coherent, kind of overall understanding of the entire brain.
That's what seems to be missing, is the fact that all science at the moment just is so compartmentalised. They don't see the bigger picture, and they don't see the mind, body, and the spirit of it.
Yeah.
And that's where your theory does come into its own and sort of bridges all the gaps.
Oh yes. Apart from the science, kind of linking up different brain regions and all these kind of results from psychology, psychophysics, etc. The real interesting unification is bridging the brain theory with these mystical ideas, because the idea that the mystery of consciousness and the mystery of God, once we accept that there's this kind of deep relationship between ourselves, consciousness, and God, and God in big capital letters, God, God of the Bible, God of Bhagavad Gita, etc. Then what the brain theory shows is this complete correspondence between aspects of the brain theory and all these ancient mystical ideas that have been circulating, from the beginning of time, things like the cosmic tree, the cosmic battle of good and evil, this idea of emanation from a point, that somehow the universe aggregates into this Godhead thing, that all these are a part of the brain theory. So what I see the brain theory also as this kind of Trojan horse that's going to return to the world these ancient mystical ideas. And it's beautiful, it's a full circle that science really came from the mystical and the spiritual and the sacred, and that the brain theory will be the key to returning the sacred and the mystical and the spiritual back to science. Actually, on a journey here, I was listening to old psychedelic trance music I was listening to back in my 20s, and I realized that over the years, certain kinds of psychedelic trance music induce in me mystic states. It's pounding, and it's fast, and it's loud, and it's Phrygian mode, and it's quite complex, but repetitive. It's trance music. I realized that over the years, walking around the streets of London with my MP3 player and playing this music has helped induce mystic states in me. And in combination with caffeine, chocolate and sunshine and trance music, I can get into borderline mystic states and think mystic thoughts and take from this transcendent realm, I believe. So that's one instance of sound being used for something beyond just entertainment. The idea that Sufis and shaman used to use or do use repetitive beats to induce altered states of consciousness. So the idea that you can use frequencies of sound to affect the brain and mind in interesting ways that science doesn't quite totally understand. I'm open to these possibilities. Just listen to music. The fact that music is so important, that we spend so much time and money on music, it shows that it's something fundamental going on with music. I think music is a gateway to the transcendent. It's not just any simple collection of sound waves. I think it's something to remind stranded gods of the higher realm, and so that's what good art and good music does. It kind of takes you up to the sublime reaches, I believe. specifically what I talked about last night, the idea that binary trees have something to do with musical structure, common time music, folk music, pop music, and common time classical music. I believe, yeah, I mean, this fits in with lots of research in neuroscience today, which says that we appreciate certain musics on a certain level because of certain mathematical characteristics of the mathematics of sound, harmonies, etc. And I think in the future we can link up this scientific understanding of sound and music with our kind of mystical understanding of consciousness as God, maybe even scientifically work out how to create the most kind of psychedelic mind-manifesting sounds and musics in the future. For years, I mean, they thought acupuncture was a load of psychosomatic nonsense, but then they realised that it really does do profound things like cause endorphins in your body to flow, and the same drug which blocks endorphins in your body will block acupuncture, the effects of acupuncture. And even NHS, I know in my partner's first pregnancy, I mean, that they do acupuncture for turning babies, and it actually works. Amazing stuff, I mean, generally, I mean, I encounter lots of new age stuff, ideas. A lot of it I don't agree with. A lot of it's irrational and can't really be scientifically, accounted for. But I found an interesting way over the past few years to account for this kind of stuff, which might not be rational, but is actually part of the cosmic equation. Things like numbers 23, people following these irrational paths. But then I realised that this might be a kind of convoluted explanation, but it's kind of quite hard to follow. But the fact that we're approaching Godhead, but Godhead is not computable. Okay, so it's not rational in that computable sense, but it's truth, but it can't be computed. So mathematics is this idea of things that are non-computable. You can't, from axioms derive these further truths. But then these things are true. Now, this sounds really complex, but what I believe is that the universe begins. We're heading towards the future, but our future is really the beginning. So the beginning is the cosmic Christ, the Godhead, the completeness. And this is basically the truth manifest. And I believe that the universe is created for a kind of dissolution of the complete truth backwards in time. What we think of backwards in time, but this is actually the original forwards in time. And that truth is split asunder and kind of dissolved, and then it's kind of dissolved into chaos, and this chaos gets sucked into the Big Bang singularity. And this is when it's kind of this new idea in science of the time inversion, that the Big Bang is no longer the beginning, but it's the big bounce now. It's the kind of halfway point. So after the big bounce, we go, our forwards in time back to Godhead. But the thing is, Godhead is something that's non-computable, but to get back to the answer and the original complete truth, there are fragments of Godhead that have been seeded in normal reality, but these fragments are manifest as irrational fragments. And because Godhead doesn't compute rationally, these irrational fragments are necessary for the reconstitution of Godhead. So these mystical people doing crazy things, following these synchronicity trails, which are completely irrational. But at the same time, without this irrational aspect to reality, then Godhead doesn't become reassembled. Now, I know a scientist would say, that sounds completely mad. But to me, it sounds completely reasonable based on some pretty advanced ideas in logic and computer science, and it's really, interesting ideas from logic and computational theory. So it makes perfect sense to me. What I was saying last night, that the originators of science, the people who defined the game, the originators of philosophy, I mean Pythagoras, who coined the word philosophy, so in a sense, philosophy began with Pythagoras in a sense, was mystic, was worshipped as a living God-man. We know it was Pythagoras' theorem, but it was he's like a cult leader. I mean, cult in the most general sense of the word. I don't always. I seem not a misbehaving cult leader, but I mean, no, he was a mystic, uber mystic, And Leibniz, contemporary of co-inventor of calculus with Isaac Newton. I mean, both Newton and Leibniz were total mystics, total illuminates. Newton wrote more about Kabbalah, alchemy, and prophecies and occultism than he did about science. And Einstein, religion without science is blind. Science without religion is lame. So these people define the game, see things in the biggest picture, mystical, transcendent, sacred, God. And then I think lesser minds play the game that these great minds have invented, and they see a kind of very limited view of things. And then they ask, where's God? Where's the big picture? Where's the grand narrative? What's the transcendent thing? And anything that comes from the big picture that doesn't fit in a narrow perspective, this kind of narrow view of science and evolution theory, they dismiss completely. But what I believe is that this big picture needs to return. We need a kind of restoration of the kind of transcendent, the sacred, purposeful universe, meaning in the universe, to oppose selfish genes, Darwinism, cooperation, synergy, and synthesis and symbiosis. And the other kind of flaw in the modern scientific enterprise and also in modern philosophy is materialism, that science works better with idealistic assumptions. If you have scientific materialism, there's also scientific idealism. And I think this is something that's going to come back starting this year, 2012. So yeah, I mean, science now is very limited in its scope. But the funny thing is, this is very understandable because I believe that a certain mind, a certain kind of Aspergic mind that sees parts rather than the whole, they call Asperger's autism, the kind of extreme male mind, really good at concentrating on bits rather than the big picture. Is actually these people are better at passing science exams. So you tend to find science is populated with people who see parts rather than the whole. But what we need now is basically to restore the big picture to science, and I think this is very necessary, and also integrate all these different departments in science into a kind of consilience, a true consilience of a kind of unity that truth is one, and then to unify science, but also unify science back to religion, the true religion, not religion of the fundamentalists or the popes and Roman emperors.